So hey, I'm David Denon, and today I'm talking with Tomi Gomory. Tomi is an associate professor at Florida State University's College of Social Work. He is the co-author of the really interesting and excellent book, Mad Science, about the bad thinking, coercion, and corruption in American psychiatry, and also the author of many articles related to that and to social work. Today, we're going to focus on the ideas of Thomas Szasz, who was a psychiatrist as well as a critic of psychiatry. And is there anything you want to add to that little introduction?
Well, thanks, David. So basically, just a little bit more about myself. I like Tom, who we'll talk about in a bit. I'm a Hungarian refugee coming out at a different time period. But I grew up after the age of 9 in the United States. And my background, my parents were participants in the Holocaust. I'm sort of what you would classify an Eastern European Jew. And so I bring some of those cultural issues that I think also in some ways impacted Tom. My history in some ways has kind of shaped my critical sensibilities and, kind of my ideas and issues that I was interested in. I've been a teacher at Florida State University for about 23 years, and my interests are always critical. I, like maybe Tom, get the notion of being a gadfly. Of course, that's usually seen as a stigma, because it's considered that to be a critic is, like how simple it is to be a critic, easy to criticize,
right.
And you problem solve. And so that's kind of been my primary interest. Sort of this area of mental health, broadly speaking, but really dependency. What do we do dealing with people who have, through various labels, been essentially public dependents? And so that's kind of my concern. And then there's a critical view of the role of the helping professions. Are they actually helping, that sort of thing? So I think that's enough as an introduction in terms of my own kind of point of view.
Yeah, I think we'll probably come back to some of the points you mentioned about yourself. I'm curious how you basically how you met Thomas Szasz, what your guys' relationship was.
Well, so
and actually, sorry, maybe should we say a little more about who Szasz is before we before that, so people kind of understand who he is. Maybe you want to introduce who he was a little bit more than what I said earlier.
Well, so he's a very complex character, and of course, he has simply been made into a sort of a caricature. And so Tom, just in my point of view, is probably the most sophisticated, intellectually engaged person I have ever met. So, of course, that would require you to know whether I'm sophisticated and intellectual and all of that in terms of my judgment. But Tom came out in his early, let's see, probably around 20 or so, and emigrated here and essentially got his college degree and his medical degree at the University of, oh gosh, that's terrible that I'm having a momentary lapse. The major city in Ohio, gosh,
Well, there's Cleveland, what else is Ohio? Columbus, Ohio. Well, I don't know.
Well,
People can look it up, I guess.
yeah, yeah. My
It should be
apologies.
easily available. Yeah, no problem.
By way of just the point I was trying to make is academically, he was very, very high achiever. He graduated #1 in his medical class. And so the point I'm trying to make is he had a great deal of skill. This was not a person who just kind of was a moderately interesting person. He always had this kind of critical capacity. And in his biography, at least his writings, he always claimed that he wanted to undermine psychiatry. He went into the profession, undermine it because of his thinking about the nature of psychiatry. So how did I come to kind of meet Tom? Well, when I was getting my master's degree in social work, we have things like internships. So my very first internship at New York University was in sort of a inpatient setting. And when I went there, I was completely clueless about mental health. Eastern Europeans at that time certainly didn't think about that kind of conceptual way of seeing troubled human beings and emotions and all that. So I went in there totally naive. I had, I didn't have any preconceptions, but did have lots of fears because it sounded like these people are aliens, And when I got there, the clinical director brought all our we had different interns from different local New York graduate schools. And she said that I just want to caution you that the people you see here are not like you. Schizophrenics have delusions, and you got to be careful not to get lost in their delusional world. I didn't even know what the hell that meant, but I got scared. And that they're X-shaped and have body odor. Now, this is a clinical psychologist telling me this. So I was completely shook up, frightened. And what I was learning in school gave me no real handle on how to kind of view this kind of conceptual notion, except in my psychopathology class. The only thing I thought was positive in reflection was that there was one assigned reading by Thomas Szasz, which kind of undermined the conceptualization of what was being presented, essentially sort of a myth of mental illness. It was the precursor of his book. And as I read it, something clicked. I said, oh, okay, I get it. I had a way of contextualizing the issue. And as I was talking to these impatient folks, if they weren't drugged up, I really could understand what they were trying to say. And of course, without Tom's article, I would have been self-diagnosing as being lost in their delusional world. And of course, that was the beginning. So and then I read everything that Tom had published up to that time. And what happened when I was getting my PhD at Berkeley, I started actually emailing Tom. So that's how the relationship began. And I formally met Tom when I had a conference. I created a conference for him to come visit Florida State University. which was an incredible success. But so that's, this was in the early 2000s. Until his death, we became very good friends. And so that's kind of, just a quick history of my connecting with Tom.
Okay, interesting. And you mentioned before you were working on a biography of Szasz. Is that
I am currently
something you're currently working on?
Yes, and so I see it as 5 or 6 year project, and the COVID thing has put a little damper, but I'm going to probably in the early fall or next spring go visit the University of Syracuse, where his papers are, as part of the process.
Yeah. And maybe before we get in, I want to get into some of his basic ideas. I'm just curious if you have a sense of his intellectual background. I'm just curious what like his influences were. I know he was kind of reacting to and also influenced by psychoanalysis at that time. I was interested I've been reading his Myth of Mental Illness and some other things, and I was interested to see some references to the early pragmatists. There's a kind of a Peircean semiotics thing going on in the Myth of Mental Illness. He also discusses George Herbert Mead. I'm just curious what sense you have about his kind of intellectual formation, what kind of sources he's drawing on in forming his ideas.
Well, so just to contextualize, he comes from a very, very rigorous educational focus. In the early 20th century, late 19th century, sort of Middle Europe, Eastern Europe had a very, very powerful intellectual engagement with the world. Karl Popper, a whole set of philosophers, Wittgenstein, all of these folks kind of had an enormous impact. The logical positivists, all of these folks. And Tom grew up going to very rigorous educational school, high school, and so that kind of thing, which is very unusual today, rarely happens, was an essence. And of course, he like some of the folks I mentioned, like Karl Popper, had a Jewish background, but they weren't, religious.
Yeah.
But the sort of commitment of that sort of frame of reference was about rigorous learning. And so he had this very open engagement with many, many influences. He's a very complicated and sophisticated reader. He was reading since he was very young. And so I think he was deeply influenced. And of course, if you look at his writing, Karl Popper plays a role. The pragmatists, Morse Peckham, a kind of a person very much similar in the kind of intellectual engagement. He was a romantic literature expert, but of course that was a very limiting notion of who he actually was. Right. So that's an interesting parallel between them. So Tom essentially never considered himself a scientist. He never claimed to do any research. He was just deeply read and deeply referencing all of these sources to make his arguments, but he was a philosopher. Perhaps I'm not sure that's the best characterization, but that's a good one in terms of how he engaged with ideas. And that's who he was all his life, but enormously broadly and deeply read. And one of the pleasures, my co-author of that book, Mad Science, David Cohen, who's also professor of social work at UCLA, and we used to visit, and we're a good friend of Tom's as well. We used to visit him in the springtime, and those were the most exciting engagements, both personally and intellectually, that we had. So I think that's his chief quality, the deep worldly knowledge that we don't see too often these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both reading his books, and I've also been looking at some of the interviews he did, and that really comes across both the combination of his deep reading, as you mentioned, and also his kind of broad experience of life, I guess, of working with clients and all the knowledge that comes through that. I wonder if we can get into some of Szasz's basic ideas. I have a few written down, and if you have others that you want to talk about, that's great. But of course, the central idea that he's associated with is this idea of the myth of mental illness. And I think it's something that's often misunderstood. And I think it's hard to understand, actually, if you're come at it from a conventional point of view, from kind of the conventional wisdom of our society. It is a bit hard to grasp what he was talking about when he's talking about the myth of mental illness. Do you want to maybe say a little bit about what you think he meant by that?
Yes, I mean, I think you accurately characterize it as a complete misunderstanding. So let me see if I can make it a little bit clearer. But David, please, ask questions and direct me if you think there would be things to look at that I'm missing or not being clear about. So he looked around the world, and as a child and as he evolved, he saw there was a lot of human difficulty going on.
Right.
Tragic, personal and communal experiences. And so he was fully aware that there was strangeness in the world. And so, but the conceptual piece that he was trying to make clear is that the evolution of how we understand interpersonal and personal deviance, troubling or troubled behavior in terms of the medicalization of them was, from his perspective, deeply wrong-headed. So he was never denying that these behavioral and mood state experiences that people were reporting or appeared to be engaged with, he never denied those things don't exist. But he just said that the way we try to understand it in these psychiatric terms, medical modeled as diseases, was wrong-headed. And he said that there are better ways and more useful ways to think about these problems.
Right, yeah. So I wonder, I'll maybe say a little bit about what I got from just kind of reading him recently and looking at some of his interviews and stuff. And because I think, watching him sometimes be questioned, there often seemed to be kind of a barrier for understanding what he's getting at. And there's a few ways. So he explains it as a category error. Sort of mental illness is a metaphor, but it's to take it further, to try to apply that literally as a category error, because illness is something that applies to the physical organism, but it can't apply to something called the mental. And the mental, of course, would be something like the mind. So the mind is not the kind of thing that we normally describe as having illness. We can see illness in the body. We can test for illnesses in the body. We can do autopsies and find signs of illness. in the body, but we can't do the same thing for something that's mental. So that's one part of it, as it's kind of a category error to talk about mental illness. Another way that I look at it, and you can tell me if Szasz would have agreed with this or maybe what he might have said about this. Of course, I come from a background of studying a lot of the behaviorists and the pragmatists, and the way I kind of thought about it for myself is, so mental in kind of a behavioristic sense is about behavior. So if you're, and Szasz, I think, had this idea too. He talked about minding. So rather than mind as a thing, you mind, or there's minding as a kind of behavior or thing that you do. And we don't talk about illnesses of behaviors. There's not a category of behavioral illness. So the proper kind of
well, could I?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I didn't. Forgive me for interrupting, but
Sure.
I want to just disagree slightly.
Okay.
In
Sure.
fact, in mental health, we have now behavioral disorders.
Right.
This is an attempt, semantically,
Yeah.
to address something that Tom, I think, pointed out very early on, and maybe some of the behaviorals, perhaps. So we are now twisting our language,
Yeah.
to kind of control for that argument, like, oh, no, we call it now behavioral disorders. And there's a whole, NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, is talking about it this way. My profession talks about it. And of course, then we get lost.
Yeah.
Just like the mental illness label. So you see the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting that they call it a behavioral disorder. Of course, you would want to say, so mental disease or mental illness is the usual way that that label is used. I don't know if I've heard well, it's probably used mental disorder, but it's interesting that they don't use the phrase they don't use the phrase behavioral disease, which seems not to make sense, although they've used the phrase mental disease for so long that it seems to make a kind of sense, but it seems like it doesn't work in the language to say behavioral disease, so they switched it to disorder, which is an interesting kind of maybe sleight of hand or something. So I guess the categories don't quite work. There's an interesting, well, let's see, what else I wanted to mention about that. I guess the other point related to that is the issue of whether so-called mental illnesses or behavioral disorders can be explained primarily as brain diseases or not, or disorders of the brain, dysfunctions of the brain, and whether if mental diseases can be explained as brain diseases, that gets rid of the category of mental disease. And this is something else that Szasz talked about related to this idea of the myth of mental illness. Do you have any, want to say anything about this idea of sort of mental illness being replaced at some point by brain illness?
Well, I mean, so this it's interesting how psychiatrists twist these issues to suit their own confirmatory biases. But he had a very simple argument. He said, signs and symptoms in ordinary physiological diseases are more or less clear. Medicine is not a perfect science. There are situations that don't currently have great explanations, but many, many medical issues are rather clear. Things on the margin can be a little fuzzy. And of course, you have to know something about that so-called science of medicine to, understand. And so it leads to kind of the capacity to fudge, psychiatrists fudging these issues by emphasizing the fuzzy rather than the ones that really are telling, cancers. Of course, you have precancerous cells. It doesn't negate the fact that we have ways of identifying pretty well if you have cancer. You see, and so psychiatry tends to want to argue, well, it's not categorical, but of course it is more or less, because that's the nature of science. Science is fallible, and we have to constantly keep testing. But so he just had that simple idea. Look, apparently there are many physiological disease processes that are pretty identifiable. There isn't one mental illness that is.
Right.
So that's all he said. He said, look, there seems to be a tremendous, so the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So that's where the language disorder, which he felt was just a bastardization of disease to make it less arguable.
Right.
So he just said that none of those that are listed, although now, I'm sorry for always having to say but, they have put things like Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I was just noticing that.
They put real neurological disorders in there just to fuzz up things. They also list, drug-induced mental disorders, which is just an admission that the drug treatments, brain damage and cause those sorts of things. It's very interesting and very clever strategically, how you fuzz up, sort of what could be rather easy. So this is the complexity of the problem of mental illness, is that this is a constant strategy of disorientation and disguise. And so my life is very difficult for that reason when I'm trying to teach my students. But he said, so that's it. It's a simple thing, when it's identifiable through, some sort of lesion or marker or whatever, it's a neurological disease. And he cites things like, before we had actually understanding of the idea of general paresis, which was the mental disorder. But once we found the spirit set of the causal factor, it became syphilis. Simple. So, he has examples like that, which seems to me fairly straightforward, shouldn't be difficult. And I present the ideas to my students in the same way. And you do have to make that categorical thing and then talk about the fuzzy in order for the students to kind of get the problem. But it seemed to me fairly straightforward. His argument wasn't, and all that, I think, difficult to understand. But what's interesting is the complications that the psychiatrists defending their lives, their professional lives, tended to camouflage. It's very interesting.
Yeah. One of the nice distinctions or analytical distinctions Szasz makes, at least in the book, The Myth of Mental Illness, that gets at some of this, is a distinction between happenings and actions. So, and this kind of maybe cuts through many of the other categories we make in medicine or psychiatry. But there's things that happen to you, like maybe a toxin gets into your body, or you get hit by a car, or some cells turn cancerous, or something like that. These are not really things that you do, they're things that happen to you. And that's one kind of problem that people have. But there's another kind of problem that people have that arises from their actions in relation to whatever situation they're in. And this is more what's normally classified as mental illness. But I think he's arguing that it's better to see it as a kind of action, as coming from an agent. He's really insistent upon giving people agency, which I think is a really interesting point about him. But he wants to make this division between happenings and actions, and talking about how a lot of problems in life are not just things that happen to you, but they come out of the relationships you have with your through your actions with other people, your environment. And so there's another set of problems that should be dealt with, I think, in his view, in another way, not in a medical way. I think he's against medicalizing those problems that come through our kind of interactions, social interactions. He sees these more as ethical, moral, religious types of problems that should be dealt with in possibly a different way, although he seems pretty open to how people should deal with their problems, but he doesn't think that we should medicalize, it's fine to medicalize things that happen to you. We go to a doctor when something bad happens to us, physically. But that's not necessarily the right approach, and certainly not the right approach if it's coercive, if we are having some kind of problem in our behaviors, in our relationships with other people, our relationships to our social circumstances. If you want to say anything more about that distinction he makes.
Well, clearly he wants to recognize volition.
Yeah.
The ability of human beings to do this rather than that. And what he emphasized is that all behavior has meaning. This was the fundamental piece that, which psychiatry, sort of conventional psychiatry wants to completely undermine. And he said that if you take the time and the person is willing to trust you, you can learn what their reason was for doing whatever there was. So that's critical. I always, and he always said, behavior is never disease. It's action, it's choice making. It's, of course, all of these have been stigmatized to make him a kind of a cruel, insensitive person. It's not at all the case. And it just demonstrates people actually don't read his books closely, if at all. But I felt that's something that's very, very important and sometimes gets lost in terms of what he's trying to get across. There's that. It's interesting also, he said, that mental disorders almost always are about bad behavior.
Right.
Or what's judged not to be appropriate or expected, or all of those things. And as he pointed out, many physical diseases, you can have an enlarged heart and you can have a small heart. Those are all, issues that come up. But we don't have too much loving as a problem, a mental disorder,
right,
or being a genuine dispenser of donations, or, although I guess manic behavior could be, twisted into that sort of thing. But overwhelmingly, it's bad or troubled behavior that is judged to be a mental disorder.
Right. Yeah. And he mentions also, kind of related to that, when we have hallucinations, like if they make us uncomfortable, we call that a mental illness. But if they're, if they give us good artistic ideas or entrepreneurial ideas or scientific ideas, then we kind of hold that up as a kind of genius or creativity or something like that. So we kind of, right, so we have a negative view of one kind of behavior and a positive view of the same behavior in another, when it has maybe positive social effects or doesn't make other people uncomfortable or doesn't make the person, him or herself, uncomfortable. But he points out that it's actually the same thing, at least from the perspective of the organism of the brain. A hallucination is a hallucination, or an unconscious thought, unwilled thought is an unwilled thought, whether it makes you uncomfortable or makes you $1 million.
Well, may I just add one point?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So in terms of illustrating hallucinations or hearing voices, which is the classic, kind of schizophrenia, psychotic disorder kind of symptomatic behavior. So what I often do with my students is I ask them if they've ever heard of imaginary friends.
Right.
And almost everyone has heard of them and have possibly had imaginary friends.
Right.
And of course I ask, well, is that mental illness? And of course, no. It's kind of a normal thing that children go through. And I kind of go through the steps. Well, why? What's the purpose? And of course, there are a couple of reasons, but one of them is to help children deal with things that they are not ready to accept. And so they create this projection, which they believe is real, and the purpose is for them to be able to digest unacceptable emotions or things that they don't quite have a way to assess, or to create, a connection. If they don't have, direct interpersonal experiences that are adequate. And so that's just a normal developmental mechanism. No one labels these kids, because of course it might take the entire population of children. You couldn't call them mentally ill. If everyone's mentally ill, then it's normal. So just pointing out things that are just anomalous, don't make sense, is important. As Karl Popper said, you have to look for the counterexample. That's the way you test. Is there an alternative hypothesis? So there are, good things pedagogically that you can engage with in order to help people understand the conceptual issues that Tom tends to be sometimes difficult to understand. I don't think he always uses the best common language.
Right.
So it's a little hard to follow. And he was a fairly sophisticated thinker. And so the assumption is you're well educated.
Right.
That was his assumption. So my job is to try to, I don't want to reduce or simplify, but somehow use language that's a little bit more common, because unfortunately, there's been some decline in, the kind of rigor in higher education than perhaps in some other earlier decades. I don't know if you agree or not, but that unfortunately is sometimes my experience.
Yeah, I probably don't have enough experience to judge that very well, but I was fairly struck. For me, Szasz is a very clear, I find him to be very clear, but then I've already had a lot of background in the ideas and the kind of references and ideas that he's dealing with. But it does seem, I wouldn't say that his books, at least nowadays, I wouldn't say that his books are meant for general readers. I think it would be tough for someone not very familiar with that area to approach them. Yeah, but his interviews I do find to be quite interesting and lucid, and I think easier to understand maybe than some of his writings for kind of regular people.
Yes.
I did want to. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we can come back to any of these points, but I did want to discuss another aspect of Szasz. Well, this is not really about Szasz, but about how people think about him, I guess. And that's the idea of, or the movement, I guess, of anti-psychiatry. And I think even on Wikipedia, Szasz is associated with or called an anti-psychiatrist. And that was one kind of movement taking place while he was working, while his career was, while he was in the middle of his career. And there's also a kind of related to that is the process of deinstitutionalization. I know you've written about some of that. I'm just wondering how you see Szasz he's fitting into these kind of mental health movements that were occurring during his lifetime, and he was sometimes associated with them. Or if you want to clarify his relationship to that.
Yes, I mean, he's completely misconstrued. He was never, ever an anti-psychiatrist, never. He was a lifetime member of the American Psychiatric Association. He was a fellow, he never said, I'm not a psychiatrist. He just said, I'm not a coercive psychiatrist. And R.D. Laing, who's another important figure in that movement, he despised him. Not personally, but because he locked up his own son. Involuntary.
So Szasz despised Laing, are you saying?
Yes. Well, he felt he was an unprincipled narcissist. He gloried in this role of being sensitive to schizophrenics while supporting hospitalization, while involuntary by definition, and also glorifying so-called schizophrenic behavior, maybe even making it better than so-called normal behavior, that it was, more kind of a description of the most genius sort of way of engaging with life, which we now have when some bipolar labels then suggest that really important artists, writers are bipolar. Again, this kind of, and of course, then it becomes a kind of a badge of honor on one level, but you're crazy. So this is this dual kind of definition. You have a sickness, but there are some goodies that go along with you being crazy. And I think this is really a deep injustice to the complexity of human behavior to go that way. But he was never an anti-psychiatrist. He wrote a book towards the end of his life that was exactly against anti-psychiatry. So if you're an intelligent, interested reader, you can look at his own book. I mean, he wrote more than 30 books, and it requires some effort. But if you're actually going to try to understand what Tom's about or the claims he's making, you need to do some heavy lifting. There's just no way out of it. That's, anyway, yeah. I'm not sure, was that?
Yeah, that's great.
Response?
Yeah, no, I was interested in, kind of clearing up that. because I know it's something that there's confusion about, I feel like. At least I noticed it online when I was doing a little research on him and looking up some critiques of him. Yeah, I wonder what you, well, I guess, what do you think is, how would you describe the, like a Zazian solution then to the problem of behavioral, people having behavioral problems that might be difficult to deal with, that might be disturbing to other people, that might be violent? I mean, I kind of have a sense of how Zaz would answer this, but I'm just curious your thoughts. You know, what would his solution be to the kinds of behavioral problems that people have that are kind of impact on other people?
Well, so let me just make an overarching comment. In general, the people we pay attention to most of the time are the people that disturb us. So someone who doesn't, just lives a life and it's odd, no one really cares. You give them different labels, an egghead, whatever. We have these kind of gentle labels and say, well, odd. And the ones that we pay attention to are the ones who trouble us, family members, people who have very, very dramatic behaviors. And so that's the first thing to kind of understand is that we only deal with people, and most of the time we deal with people who are public dependents. That is, that somehow, like the homeless, for example, which Tom writes extensively about. There's a wonderful book that I was just looking at right before we spoke. Where the heck did I just put it? I don't know. I had it all lined up here.
Was one of Zaz's books?
Yes. I'm just trying to. I was gonna. Oh yeah. So this is a wonderful book. This is sort of meant to be the second volume to Insanity: The Ideas of and Consequence. He has so I'm deeply involved with the homeless issue. I have been for a long time, and I'm still trying to make up my mind, how to interpret it. But he has an entire section on homelessness, which is so insightful. But the general population of public dependency, which is really the main concern of the public, people who seem offensive or, they might want to kill themselves. So those are very powerful images and experiences. So there's no question that this is deeply concerning to people. And these are all labeled, and, at least 30%, a third of the people in homelessness are considered to be mentally ill. And another third who have drug issues, but those are actually deeply connected ideas. Which Tom talks about in terms of drug use. And so, 66% of the homeless are these crazy people that we control. And so his argument is that much of the sort of the systems, criminal justice, the psychiatric system, the social service in industries, homelessness is an industry on its own, are all meant to warehouse people who don't seem to be of much use. Now, of course, I'm using terms which could be interpreted as cruel. That's why he called it cruel compassion. But it's not. I've been doing social work for 35 years. But I think you have to be able to understand the problem as clearly as you can and not use, we call these professions, social, part of them, helping professions. So with my students, I say, well, shouldn't it be called helping professions with a question mark at the end? You know, it's an empirical question whether we're helping.
So whether you're helping, yeah.
You see, because, you know, we do harm, you know, we often separate families, we lock people up. The presumption that we're right in all the, you know, and our assessment system is a disaster. In general assessment, you cannot assess individual behavior accurately, meaning you cannot predict if the behavior will recur or when. So these are some deep problems in terms of the language we use, you know, because assessment tools are developed statistically. But statistics never can speak to an individual's behavior. There's no predictive, because, you know, normal curve issues. But nevertheless, this is the rhetoric my kids get, meaning my students. You know, they go to an agency and they're told to assess using these tools. And they never hear, except maybe in my class or folks who see this problem, that you cannot use those tools. It's to accurately assess whoever you're seeing. But that's what's done because there has to be a justification for why we do things to people. And so it's like a save your ass technique, you know, so that the agency can say, you know, if someone kills themselves, well, we did everything we could. So it's a political act rather than a meaningful, helpful act. And so anyway, the social work is one of the places, like Tom went into it. I went into it to try to maybe clarify what helping should be and how we can be helpful. And so in some ways, I paralleled Tom's agenda. But again, the difficulty with trying to understand his perspectives is that he says things that are too truthful. You know, our society has to control people who are not conforming to our expectations. And so he argues that what my profession, his profession, we serve this, you know, soft policing role of controlling people who create problems.
Is there what do you see maybe as an alternative, or, I mean, is that the best we can do, do you think? Is there an alternative system? I mean, is there a way to move towards an alternative system that might look a little better than what we have now?
Yes, no question. That's the good, because, you know, my students say, well, okay, Gomory, you're critiquing all over the place, but we have to go and be social workers. You know, what's, you know, it's easy for you to be a critic. And so Tom himself said that if you conceive of help, this kind of the various ways we conceive of as education. And so teaching is a wonderful example. So if people want to dismiss the idea that you can talk with people and they may actually learn something in terms of addressing their personal problems. So education is a good model when it's working, right? That change can happen. So he always said that the only thing you can do is if the person's willing to talk to you. That's the first. So you have to have what we call in my my sort of profession, therapeutic alliance, but it's just a glorified academic term for trust and, a meaningful relationship that's not based on power differential. So if the person is willing to listen and you are willing to engage at their, with respect for them, rather than, having this power, I'm a psychiatrist, I know how you really function, then you could have meaningful conversations in terms of their problems and what options they have, maybe learning a little bit about their own history, maybe helping them kind of rethink what's been going on and giving them tools of choice. Sometimes folks are totally destroyed by their, educational and learning histories. They are given the sense that they are not capable human beings. They have no sense of self or efficacy. I can't do that. I don't have. So those are the things that you, in conversation, can help persons learn and then give them options. So you could do this, you could do that. What do you want to do? Understanding ultimately that your job, if you're a so-called therapist, I call what I do education. The best you can do is offer people the ability to decide what it is they want to do, even if it means no change after exploring it. I'll continue doing, I'll continue using drugs because that outweighs the alternatives. The presumption is that, what we label as bad is by definition really bad for everyone. It's contextual. Orson Welles is one of my favorite examples, really a very, very skilled actor, director, very, very intelligent man. And he had this personal predilection for loving food, right? Mm-hmm. And, the stories about him were his gargantuan appetite. Mm-hmm. The notion, and he essentially, died relatively early because of the choices he made. Does that make him any less an important and respectable character? In other words, the idea that you have to live forever, that's the goal in life as opposed to achievement. Mozart is another example, right. Where you have incredible creations that are very, very important to the world, but you die early. You see, so our sort of public health model says that's the most important thing to focus on. But that's just, a judgment by conventional authorities about how we should view our lives. Right. And so what he tried to point out is that's an adult's choice. Tom always said that as long as you're not doing harm to others, meaning physical harm, violence, that sort of thing, you should not be restrained, even if you are doing things that, the family disapproves of, other people disapprove of. That's not your role. You're not the parental figure to make decisions for other adults. So that's his big concept, I think. But it doesn't mean that he in any way is a mean-spirited human being. He never said, leave the homeless on the streets. Don't do anything for them. What he said was that what we should do is offer help. Right. For any problem that a human being seems to need help for, and we are willing to provide an opportunity to work with that person, absolutely appropriate. What is inappropriate is to do the involuntary hospitalization, removing people off the streets like we do now in big cities against their will, without offering them some reasonable alternative, because then we're doing like social policy, aren't we? So we ought to be saying, what's the harm? What are the alternatives that we could be? So there are real, so what he was saying to me was absolutely pragmatic and was not in any way cruel. He was the most sensitive person imaginable, on a one-to-one basis. But also, if you read his books, these never come across, except if you are, skimming and looking at, little scrapes or paragraphs. So his solution is voluntary offering of help, which I think is actually, in practice, the best you can do. I don't know if there's an alternative that has shown more positive outcomes,
Yeah, I don't know. I can see different sides of it. I definitely think offering help is something that we don't do enough of. I do also see that, there is an issue of, I hate to use this word, but social order at the same time, that if people are doing, if there's too much of, if there's too much of a section of the population, as we see a little bit in some cities on the West Coast. I don't know how much it is, how similar that is to what's happening around where you live, but where there's a large kind of homeless population, and it does impact in a lot of ways on the functioning of the city. And there's definitely not, well, at least it doesn't sound like there's a big effort to help them as in the way you're describing. But I also wonder, even if there was, if a sizable enough section refused help, I wonder what kind of solutions.
Well, that's, it's really straightforward. It's not a mystery. So there are public laws, about expected social behavior. And he said, whatever society deems as illegal, that's the rule of the game.
Yeah.
So he was just saying, don't target people as labeled mentally ill or drug addicted. They're breaking public order. And so it would be the same as if you and I behaved inappropriately. He just said you have to treat all the adults the same way. And of course, what he said was by creating this extra set of criteria, drug addicted, mentally ill, you complicate things, because then you bring this argument of treatment into it, which sounds as if somehow you're doing something good for the people, but it's actually the same thing as, enforcing the law. But we feel better about it. In fact, sometimes even creating brain damage, if we drug these crazies, if you're antipsychotics and antidepressants have severe adverse effects. The Federal Drug Administration is clear about the problems, the adverse effects. People call it side effects, strategically. Chemicals only have effects. Side effects are the ones we want. Well, yeah, it's not so bad. It's all interesting to think about these things, and it's shaping. This is Peckham's wonderful ideas about how we shape through redundancies a understanding of issues. Here it's a misunderstanding of issues, but and so Tom said, let's be clear about what we're doing. We're enforcing public policy here. And so the homeless, the reason they're accumulating, by the way, is because of this ambivalence. We don't know how to treat them.
Yeah.
See, we treat them as, well, not quite normal, and so we're confused because we have chosen to complicate a certain group of behaviors. We have people who skydive. We don't keep them from risking their life and limb.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of threat is also very, very specific and kind of calculated. And it's all about terrible things. I don't want to see a homeless person sleeping on the road in front of where I live. Of course, it's understandable. But the rule has not been clear enough. It's interesting that, for example, I'm a member of a board of a local homeless comprehensive center. So I've seen this for 35 years. And so I'm very clear that unless you're really, really befuddled by drugs and you've been permanently brain damaged, or you have some neurological problems, because of course, homeless center environment is very similar to what mental health facilities look like. It has almost identical populations. I have a term for it, functional diagnosis. If you look at all the people who are, in these facilities, functional diagnosis means that it's behaviors, troubling behaviors that we see, as opposed to the DSM diagnosis, which are psychiatric diagnosis. All those people who are severely and persistently mentally ill, that's a functional diagnosis. It just combines all those people because it's a recognition that the DSM is meaningless, but a functional description or diagnosis isn't, because it's behavioral. And we lump all those people together in terms of how we view it. So when you call them drug addicted, that's not a real explanation. It's just our easy go-to, as opposed to, well, people do choose to take drugs. The scientific argument really fails where they say, well, they're addicted and all that, they can't help it. That's never the case, because consistent counterexamples, people give up drugs in rather large numbers, routinely. In other words, the problem is that these are easy understandings. That's one of our great difficulties, is if you call someone mentally ill, it sounds like you're saying something. You see? And the marketing of it, well, and if you're not a person involved in understanding these issues, it sounds right. And that's as far as people's analysis generally goes. And that's an informational difficulty, how to get people to really understand, are we saying anything?
That is, right. That is another, I guess, resistance to Szasz, or maybe misunderstanding of Szasz, just to emphasize something you mentioned like a minute ago, is that he wants, at least as I understand him and as you have explained him, he wants us to be, I think, consistent in how we treat kind of a class of adults. So the mentally ill, I take him to be saying, should be subject to the same freedoms and punishments as everyone else. So they should, make their own choices. But if they break, as you mentioned, the public laws, they should be punished according to the laws. But at the same time, mental illness is not an excuse, right? It's not an excuse for a crime. So it's not an excuse for a crime, but it's also not, it shouldn't be an excuse for just locking someone up.
Yeah, and
That's interesting.
just one proviso, David.
Mhm.
And he said that we actually have a very good legal process for incompetence.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
so he felt that all issues of incompetence should be a legal process, not a
Mhm.
psychiatric one.
Right.
And so he had an explanation of how you come to that judgment,
Okay.
because he felt that the law is the fairest. Maybe, it's not
Not perfect,
ideal,
but yeah.
but it's the best process in a democracy that we have available to make these kinds of judgments about the competency of a person, as opposed to have a psychiatrist essentially make arbitrary decisions. There's no science behind, a psychiatrist's decision, no actual empirical science. And so he did have a mechanism, which sometimes people don't remember. He says, judge like you judge any competency issue about
Yeah.
a person's ability to make good judgments or bad judgments.
Okay, yeah, that's really interesting to know. Good. So maybe to wrap things up here, let's see. Oh, well, before I ask like a couple of closing questions, are there any other major ideas or misunderstandings that you want to mention about Szasz?
Well, he had a most wonderful view in terms of giving adults the right to be self-responsible, views about drugs, which is now, of course, apparently being taken on as appropriate, that adults should be free to choose what they want to put into their body. And of course, he was on board with women's rights and all of those things. Although he's sometimes mislabeled as a conservative or a reactionary. So his political points of view are often the lead stigma that's applied to Tom. And of course, the reality is that he said, look at the facts. Why is my political perspective the way you demonize me? Am I misstating things? Am I inaccurately identifying the issues? So the politics for Tom were very difficult because he was an honest, open guy. He never tried to prevaricate or mislead. He believed in classical liberalism, or being a political libertarian, I guess, is an alternative. Yeah. But so that's an important issue. The thing that he was very big on is that we know so little. So the idea of number one, I'm sorry, I have a couple of thoughts simultaneously.
Sure.
I'm sorry if I'm sort of talking simultaneously about
yeah, no problem.
Different concepts. But one was that was very important for him was to understand that we never have volitional behavior or causal behavior that you can associate with a particular organ of the body.
Yeah.
An entire person makes decisions. And so the current tendency of this reductivist thinking of, well, it's the brain, somehow it's, the brain is the driver. Well, of course, if you remove the heart, you have no person, that's a very, very simplified point of view. Of course, the brain is an essential component of a person who makes decisions, but it's the entire person. And so we don't credit the organism as the responsible thing in terms of human behavior. And so that's what allows psychiatry to focus on the brain and brain issues. There's no science. Unfortunately, I've been doing this so long that I tend to sound dismissive. But what I'm saying is, please look at the empirical literature and see if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
But sometimes because, I get a little impatient with some of the, not your questions, but sometimes I get these things, and of course the misleading things like brain scans and things like this, that, there used to be a notion of schizophrenic brains, and there still may be, or bipolar brains or ADHD. Well, but you need to look at the really deeply troubling research using these tools. They're exceptionally troubling. And the idea that lighting up processes are causal. The brain causes this as opposed to the brain reacting to experiences. Right? So, and we have no idea. Noam Chomsky, who certainly was not a right-winger, is not a right-winger, notoriously said that there are problems and mysteries.
Right.
And what he meant by mysteries is that, and he meant specifically brain function, that we may never understand the brain. So volitional behavior, according to Chomsky, I'm just using him because he's considered to have some expertise in these areas, although critical of some behavioralists. Just said, we have no clue about how volitional behavior happens. What psychiatrists claim, they know without a shred of evidence, because that's what they're saying. Your behavior is because you're schizophrenic. So there's such a deep divide between what we know scientifically and the political power that's given to psychiatrists to make claims about what clearly has not been demonstrated in any way scientifically. You see, these are just, and the most important thing I want to say, and I'm sorry if I'm going on too long, is that what Tom was against most emphatically is anything done coercively to adults who are supposedly competent to make decisions. And I mean competency based on the legal process, not the judgment of psychiatrists or, the average community member. And so he said, if a person wants to get ECT, electroconvulsive treatment, although it's deeply problematic, that's up to them. They want to take any drug, it's up to them. And if they feel it works, wonderful. Congratulations. He was never for stigmatizing anything that's chosen. And of course, that's the issue around suicide, is that he wanted to provide the choice and the decision about the meaning of life to be made by the adult person, not some outside judge that's authorized. And so now, so I've always admired Tom for it, and he was always very rigorous. And I think ultimately, to end his life, he decided to do it on his own. And so he was always very consistent and incredibly open to being critiqued. And of course, he wrote great responses to criticisms if people are interested. He was an admirer of Karl Popper. For some of you who may be interested, one of the great 20th century philosophers of science. And he admired pragmatism and one of your favorite academics and mine, Morse Peckham.
Right. Well, excellent. Good way to finish things up. I think, yeah, very good summary of some of his main points there. I'm sure some of that will be maybe strike people as if they haven't been exposed to this ideas before. Some of that will strike people maybe as hard to grasp. But yeah, maybe we'll have more to say about those things in the future about, yeah, well, I won't get into too many other details here. People might wonder why I don't press on some of these points, but I kind of already agree on much of what you've mentioned. And so I'll let things kind of rest at that point where they are. I think a really good kind of summing up of some of Szasz's major ideas and why he's important. Before we go, I'm wondering if you had to choose maybe one or two writings by Szasz that would be accessible to people or that you think are especially especially characteristic of Tom, what would you maybe recommend that people look at?
Well, so I don't have Insanity and the idea and its consequences, but it's a great summary of his issues around sort of this behavioral stuff, what we call mental illness issues. It's a wonderful summary. Myth of mental illness can be a little difficult to understand, and it was relatively early in his writing development. So I would recommend Insanity and Its Consequences if you're interested in that. If you're interested in the idea of the issue of suicide, and if you want a fair-minded kind of engagement, what's called Fatal Freedom is an important read. And of course, my agenda is for you to look at it critically and then follow up. Rather than assume that an alternative like reading Tom is somehow the correct thing. That's up to you to decide on your own. And I always recommend not accepting anything, but testing anything that you hear. Pharmacracy is kind of a very interesting, he coined this term, although it's been taken by others, of the therapeutic state, which is clearly, I think, what we're under currently. But pharmacracy addresses this kind of the power of the medical approach to human behavior. That's wonderful. I showed Cruel Compassion earlier in the, and that's a good start. If you get into it, you can't go wrong with any book because he is such an insightful analyst and he always provides references. He's not just arguing ideas, but he says, here's a reference that you can read that's not me. And that's important. Yeah. I just want to say this because I always get such pleasure out of telling my students, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the criteria by which we do mental illness in America, has not a single reference for any of the claims, which appears to be a medical document.
Did not know that.
So that's a problem because what they're saying is, of course, we've done a lot of research, but go you find it. Well, if it's meant to be educational as well as effective, I think you actually have to put those things in there so that people can easily look up the scientific claims. And you wonder, they charge over $100. They couldn't include that extra goodie, in a tool essentially that funds mental health. That's the reason we have to diagnose. In order to get paid, mental health organizations must use the DSM. That's the political kind of policy. Isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
maybe we've gone on too long.
Well, no, I think it was just right for me, at least. Well, thanks for taking the time to talk to me about Thomas Szasz. It's been a real pleasure for me to start learning about him. It's a name that I'd heard for some years, but didn't know much about until I got in contact with you. And I have kind of a rule where I try not to judge anyone until I spend a lot of time, something like 20. I have kind of a rule around, I don't know, 25, 30 hours, 50 hours, until I've spent a certain amount of time kind of reading their work, kind of trying to experience what they were about. And so I'm not quite there, I think, with Szasz yet, but I'm glad that I got to him sooner rather than later. And I hope other people will take a chance to get to know his work a little bit, I think, and not just, I feel he's one of those names that gets brought up and dismissed because people have a kind of stereotype about who he was if they know who he was. And I think definitely he pays some careful reading, or repays careful reading. So anyways, thank you so much for taking some time to discuss Szasz with me.
Well, David, it's been my pleasure, and I look forward to further conversations.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thanks. Are we signing off now?
Yeah, well, I'll edit out the last words that we say. I'll edit it out there. I'll stop the video.
So and this doesn't need to be included, but you did ask, did I have any limitations in terms of time?
Yeah, that was on my list. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I have no limitations in terms of his views on mental health issues. I'm in total agreement with that. I guess the one thing, and I'm not sure if this is a limitation, is that I have some concerns about things that he didn't openly say about some of the issues that, for example, he was associated with the Scientologists.
Right. Yeah, I think I saw something about that. Yeah.
And so that to me was a questionable thing. He's complete, he said, look, they agree with my points of view, on mental health and all that. I think that sometimes you really do have to look at it a little bit beyond that in terms of that organization's kind of way of dealing with the world and you associating yourself with them. He tended, so that was one issue, that he didn't really, in my judgment, make the best decision in that. And he also was such a clear libertarian that we didn't talk about this, but there was an attempt to oust him from the medical school at Syracuse, and it was a legal effort. And they wanted
because he was a libertarian.
No, because he was the myth of mental health guy.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so the mental health, the public mental health administration in the state wanted to get him out.
Yeah.
He was so contrary. And what happened was that a couple of his colleagues And it was a tenure issue. And he ultimately won, and he wasn't kicked out. But he had a couple of assistant profs who didn't have tenure, who were really thoughtful guys. And he didn't come to their defense, and they were fired. So I thought that was, a real self-serving kind of approach. Yeah. He abandoned them, essentially.
Right.
And I thought that was a little unprincipled. So there are human limitations to Tom that, so I don't believe he was a perfect, intellectual or personal, a person himself. There are limitations, and there are some others that I'd rather not publicly talk about. So yes, he was a fallible person, right. But it far is overshadowed by the important ideas that continue to be important. Some of them, of course, have been internalized by psychiatry. That's what you do, right? You kind of don't say we're wrong. You never say a good scientist says, yeah, we're wrong. What they've done is they've internalized, accommodated. And so they say, well, look, that's cool. Yeah, that's a good point. And we've always been in agreement. And so that's what happens. Karl Popper is, a very similar person. I know we're beyond the thing, and I don't mean to.
No, it's no problem.
But Karl Popper's ideas are so prevalent that no one actually references them. It's as if everyone, of course, we all
common sense.
And and I'm always disturbed when I see academics, philosophers, that he advanced these ideas most importantly, but hardly anyone, induction, deduction issues. Well, clearly although there are all these complicated, very difficult to understand ideas why there is a sort of induction, when I think that the problem is very clear. You cannot predict the future from prior observation. It's just, that's it. You can discuss it, you can call it different names, and you can say, well, maybe, but factually, that's it. So it's like Szasz. He has a very clear idea, and he's too clear. And philosophers who want to make a living then go endlessly, going through the nuances. And of course, this is mental health as well. We're doing brain scans with no meaningful philosophical and theoretical underpinning. Because so what? Right. Unless there's a lesion that is diagnostic, that every time we're correct in getting the schizophrenic right and, freeing up the normal, then that would be great. That's it. But if you have people, as we have much more overlap in terms of behavioral things in the brain. So people who don't have any diagnosis, and of course, diagnosis is a very fallible thing. I mean, who knows what that actually, how do you get that reliable and valid? But once we have overlap, it's all over.
Yeah.
Diagnostic means I can tell cancer from non-cancer, right? If you have the fuzzy edges, you have to continue watching the cell. That's the way you deal with it medically.
Yeah.
But we don't have that sort of conversation in a science of mental health. You see what I mean? I mean, these issues that constantly come up.
Yeah, I was going to say that earlier when you were talking about the brain. Um, and yeah, another thing that I got from Zaz kind of on this issue of the brain, it seems when you're reading most psychiatrists and neuroscientists that, um, I mean, there's something of an idea now, well, maybe it's older, that the brain, um, that problems in the brain cause mental problems or behavioral problems, that the source of those problems is in the brain by some part being disformed or whatever. And they try to associate, for example, atrophied hippocampus, maybe, I can't remember exactly, with depression, for example.
Yes.
But I often wonder if they've got the causation backwards. And I think that's something that Zaz is mentioning a little bit, mentioning in some places, where he talks about there's probably, I think in the myth of mental illness, he talks about there's probably chemical changes that take place in your brain when you learn a foreign language, but it's not the chemical changes that cause you to learn the foreign language. It's the changes happen because you're learning the foreign language. It's learning the language that causes changes to take place in your brain, not the other way around. And so that's kind of an analogous thing to would happen, at least with a lot of what we consider to be mental illnesses. I mean,
yes, I mean, well, David, you're absolutely right. And we have lots of contemporary research about trauma changing brain
right.
development. And of course, we have more, sort of normative ideas that complex language has different impact on a young developing brain than simplistic language. So we have very good evidence that, of course, engaging in the world, talking, having experiences does impact. It's just like, training to be an athlete.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are differences in someone who's working out, who's running, who's doing. So, I mean, this is sort of correct. And it's so undervalued in mental health because it's not convenient to the politics. Because you have, in order to use drugs, you have to have something wrong that the drug should address. And so, the whole antidepressant and anti-psychotic drug development, multi-billion-dollar a year businesses for the pharmaceutical companies enormously impact how we talk about these issues and why the focus on the brain, because you have to have a target, a physical target. To kind of sell the drug for. And of course, it's just, life is tough, David. Complicated, isn't it? But again, David, this was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I'll send it, I should get it in the next hour or two, and I'll just send it off to you. And just let me know when and if it goes up.
Okay, I will.
Take care.
You too.
I enjoyed it. It's a good way to start my morning. What time is it? Just
it's almost 11 p.m. here, so a good way to end my.
I'm sorry, I'm keeping you up. All right. Good night.
There's no problem. Good morning. I'll see you. Have a good day, I should say. Talk to you later.
Absolutely. Take care, man.
You too.